Okay, ladies and gentlemen, so the last of the macromolecules. So we so far have discussed carbohydrates, we have talked about lipids, we talked about proteins, and now we are going to talk about nucleic acid. They are the fourth macromolecule that we are going to discuss. So we're going to start where we always start in terms of what is in it. So nucleic acids, just like everybody else, has carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Also, just like the proteins, it has nitrogen, but additionally, nucleic acids have phosphorus in it, which I spelled wrong. That's okay. All right, so we have chomp. So it sounds like chomp, like with an M, but it's actually an N. So that's again carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, phosphorus. Okay, so these are the components of our nucleic acid. The monomer of a nucleic acid is called a nucleotide. And this picture right here is a structural picture of a nucleotide. Every nucleotide has three components to it. The first is a phosphate, which is where that phosphorus comes in. The second portion is a pentose sugar. Pentose meaning it just has, it's a 5-carbon sugar, so 5 carbons. And then we have a base. Specifically, it is a nitrogen base, and that's where that nitrogen comes in. And then the rest of it, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, that is in there like all the other things. Anyways, this one more time is a model of a nucleotide. And again, the nucleotide is always going to be composed of a phosphorus group, a pentose sugar, that's a 5-carbon sugar, and a nitrogen base. And there are 4 different types of nitrogen bases, but we'll get into that in a moment. The polymers, so these nucleotides are, of course, the building blocks of the nucleic acid, because that's what a monomer is. So what are the polymers of the nucleic acids? Well, the polymers are going to be DNA and RNA. Okay, and I'm sure you have heard about DNA and RNA before. So what is the primary function of a nucleic acid? Well, we've talked about DNA, obviously, you know all about DNA. So the primary function of RNA and DNA is to store and transmit heredity, or we would call it genetic. Spelled wrong, but that's okay. Okay, so that is the function of nucleic acids. They store and transmit hereditary information or genetic information. I do want to remind you at this point, ladies and gentlemen, that all living things, remember when we talked about the 8 characteristics of all living things? One of the characteristics of all living things is that they had a universal genetic code. This is it. This is the nucleotide that builds that universal genetic code, the DNA, and then, of course, the RNA. But we'll talk more about that later when we get more into genetics. But this is where your genetic information is stored. One more time, DNA, RNA are made up of nucleotides, phosphorus group, the pentose sugar, and a nitrogen base. This is the basic building block of all DNA and RNA. All right, so what are the differences between DNA and RNA? DNA is a double strand. So it looks kind of like the sort of twisted ladder looking thing. type and talk at the same time, but that's okay. Strand. Strand. There it is. And then the RNA is a single strand. DNA stays in the nucleus of the cells. RNA travels outside of the nucleus. And then when we talk about those base pairs, those nitrogen pairs, DNA has 4 nitrogen bases, and those 4 nitrogen bases are A, T, C, and G. The A stands for adenine, T is thymine, oops, C is cytosine, and G is guanine. RNA, much like DNA, still has A, it still has C, it still has U, it still has C and G, but instead of having a T, it has this thing called U, which stands for uracil. So that is the basis of our nucleic acids. One more time: carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus. The monomer is a nucleotide, which consists of a phosphate group, a pentose sugar, and a nitrogen base. You get these nucleotides chained together to make a polymer. The polymers end up being DNA and RNA. The function of DNA and RNA is to store and transmit genetic information. And then, of course, we have a few differences between DNA and RNA. The most notable, of course, being that DNA is double-stranded, RNA is single-stranded, and even though they have 3 of the same nitrogen bases, they do have the difference of thymine and uracil. All right, ladies and gentlemen, that concludes our notes on the macromolecules.